Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Francois, for inviting me to speak. This is the first time I'm actually speaking about my book as a whole book rather than bits and pieces of it at different conferences, and so it's a great opportunity. And I also may leave stuff out. So if there's anything that's not clear, I'm happy to answer questions in the end. My book, as you can see, displayed very largely. That's the biggest screen I've ever seen. Is Acting Egyptian, Theater, Identity, and Political Culture in Cairo, 1869 to 1930. I thought I would start with a person and then talk a little bit more about the book as a whole. So in the last chapter of my book, I write about female performers in the early 20th century. And the image here is of a woman named Munira al-Mahdiyya, who lived roughly between 1885, but people completely guess about when she was born because there were no real good records, but she passed away in 1965. Munira sang from a young age. She performed in coffee houses for much of her young career, and then she became the first female Muslim actress in Egypt. Before her, there were women on stage, but they tended to be Christian, Jewish, or from other countries, Syria or Europe. By the mid-1910s, Mahdiyya was recording with gramophone, Betaphone, and other prominent recording companies at the time, so there are records that exist of her singing. And soon after that, she would start to manage her own theater troupe, and after that, open her own music hall. So she became quite successful in her time. Now in 1919, which was a significant year in Egyptian history, and I'll come back to that, Munira was performing, this is with her own troupe now, and she started her performances in a new way. Before the curtain would rise, she would step out in front of the curtain and say a few lines, and these are the kind of like tail end of what she would say. She keeps the laws of decency and afef. Afef meaning, it's a concept, as I describe up here, of a woman of virtue and integrity. It's a very, very old concept, an indigenous concept. Right? She keeps the laws of decency and afef. She suppresses her emotion for the sake of her nation and honor. Now, as a woman who was involved in what was considered a morally dubious profession, and it was, what did it mean that she would link that performance that she was about to do to concepts of decency, honor, and national duty? The period that I cover in my book, 1869 to 1930, was one of major social and political disruption in Egypt. In that 40-year period, Egypt went from being an Ottoman province to a British protectorate in 1882 to an independent nation state, at least in theory, in 1922. The British were still there. In 1919, as I mentioned, a significant year, protests, anti-British protests peaked as people all across Egypt, particularly, of course, in major cities, but also in provinces, flooded the streets to demand their independence. And as you can see from this picture, these are not just men, right? You have women and men, you have people who are old and young, you have lots of different colors of people who are out in the streets. So this is considered a really important moment in Egyptian history where people come together demanding independence, okay? Now, this particular photo was taken when Saad Zaghloul, who was a major leader at the time, was released from when he was brought back to Egypt because he had been temporarily exiled. So this is a happy moment. My book spans this period that I just mentioned. So it opens with the urban renewal of Cairo and the inauguration of the Connubial Opera House in 1869. And it closes with demands for independence from Britain and the growth of women's cabarets in the 1920s. This is an external photograph of the Connubial Opera House, which is no more. I'm not going to talk about it that much today, but it was built in 6 months and mostly of wood. So you can imagine it wasn't that sturdy, although it did last for quite some time before it was burned down in the 70s. This is an interior shot, which I think is pretty great to get a sense of what's going on. It's taken much later, it's 1927, and as you might be able to tell, it's not that great of in terms of clarity, but there's no performance going on here, although you could say there's a performance going on here. But this is a meeting during the era of a later king. It was a conference on cotton that they were having in the Opera House, so large space. But what I think is interesting here is that you get a sense of, if anyone is familiar with opera houses at all, it looks a lot like La Scala in Milan, and that was on purpose. It was designed to look like that. So in this era of political upheaval, just to return back to Muriel Mahdeya for a moment, the rhetoric surrounding this revolution of 1919 provided a language for women, in the case that I'm talking about, but also for others, to link their public presence to the well-being of the nation. Mahdeya, in particular, blended nationalist rhetoric with older signs and concepts of female respectability to create new conceptions of what a modern woman could be. So she's blending things in order to say something new. But it wasn't just women. In late 19th and early 20th century Egypt, there were men and women, working classes and elites, who were using the dramatic stage to reckon with what it meant to be modern and Egyptian. So my book joins a number of others that are pushing back on what was long considered to be the sort of definitive story of Egyptian nationhood, which is that, you know, there's one story, there's one nation, there's one people, and, you know, it's a nationalist history written by the folks who became Egypt's political and cultural leaders, and featuring them, of course, as the heroes of the story as well. So I'm pushing back against that, but those people are in my book as well. Who are they? They were an emerging class, and I'm saying class loosely here, of urban male professionals who had secular educations. They were being educated in these newer schools rather than the traditional form of religious learning, and nationalist leanings, and the term that's often used to discuss this group of people is effendi. That word is old, but in this particular moment it takes on a certain significance. So they're effendis, and they fashioned themselves into Egypt's anti-colonial leaders. I have a couple of images that are like, I don't know these people. I found these images, they were collected by the American University in Cairo, of a family the Dr. Iskandar family, and they just found these images that had been cast out. The families of the American University in Cairo collected them. But what I want you to notice is, like, here's one image, okay, and then here's another one. These are effendis, okay, the men, right? Let me return to that. So contrary to the way that they represented themselves, they were actually quite a diverse group of people, meaning diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of background, in terms of religion, and relationship to religion. But over time, what they do is form a narrative of consensus on issues of modernity, authenticity, nationalism, and those ideas come to be hegemonic. So what are those ideas? Some of them you can sort of pick out from the picture. You can see maybe you could guess that they're going to be proponents of companionate marriage. Okay, they're proponents of respectability, certain measures of respectability, discipline, education, particular kind of education, scientific, and so on. But the point here is that what they're trying to say, or what the message that they're giving is that to be an effendi was to be a modern Egyptian, and vice versa. The theater, was an ideal means and space in which to cultivate their own identities and to disseminate those ideals to others. In the early 20th century, there was actually an explosion of theatrical troupes, Arabic language theatrical troupes in Egypt, who were moving into these renovated sections of Egypt that one of which I would call a theater district. And they were renting theaters and putting on plays. Some of them were translated plays and some of them were original plays, but all in Arabic language. And the newspapers were very much involved in encouraging people to come and learn and be educated in these spaces. And these are really different spaces than what older forms of theater would have been, where you're in the street and people are calling and shouting and there's a lot of back and forth and the actors are responding to what the people are saying. No, these are theaters like we know theaters, where you sit in a particular seat with a ticket, you come on a certain day at a certain time, and there's a stage and a fourth wall, that invisible wall that separates you from what's happening on the stage. So even though they're claiming that there is this unified identity, they're performing it themselves, they're trying to disseminate it, but what I know and what you know is that Egyptian society was and is anything but a single and harmonious nation. So my question in coming to this project was, what about the other people? What did they think? What did they have to say? What, if anything, for them did it mean to be modern and to be Egyptian? And I had to do a lot of searching in order to find them. So in terms of sources, I spent time in both Cairo, I mean I did go to Alexandria, but I didn't do as much searching there, but also in London, and scraped together some scripts from plays, playbills. This is an example of one playbill that's in a private collection, so there was a lot of luck in this as well, just being in the right place at the right time, learning that there's one person who has a host of these things and who allowed me to go in and take a picture of them. I mean, there's a lot of that. But this was a really famous actor named Ali Al-Qassar, who had a theater called the Majestic Theater, and he was putting on 4 plays, so they have these programs that tell you who's performing, and who's going to be singing, and who's the actress, and who's the lead actor, and so on. So I found all these things, some of which were reviews in the Egyptian press. Some of them were private memoirs that were written by Egyptians and British and French observers of these. And of course I had to drink a lot of tea with a lot of people in order to get all this information. A lot of tea. I'm happy to talk about that if you would like. It's pretty interesting how you get access to this stuff. It's not so straightforward. Anyway, I saw that studying these performances, looking at the actors, the jesters, the performing women, working class men, and others who are engaged in theater, what that did was illuminate for me how Egyptian Effendi nationalism emerged, but also was challenged in these unconventional, unofficial spaces. What I found was that theater and performance offered venues and language for urban Egyptians, for men and women, all sorts of people who are often missing from traditional histories. Those were the spaces where they could play with, undermine, and champion modern identities that sometimes mirrored and other times challenged the unified Egyptian identity asserted by those in power. Rather than tacitly accepting what would become these persistent Effendi ideals, performers and their audiences generated pluralistic notions of nation and identity. But here's the thing. On the one hand, they demonstrated that, my sources demonstrated that efforts to forge a unified national identity did not erase other identities that were shaped by class, gender, place of origin, and so on, all these other categories of belonging. But on the other hand, it's inescapable that the Effendi nationalism, at least on the surface, was dominant. And the truth is that by representing and critiquing Effendi cultural norms, even critiquing them, these performers were helping to consolidate them at the same time. And so that's what I sort of came to. Yeah. I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer